This is Whiskey Whereabouts. I'm Tim, and today we're going to have a little fun. We're going to play sort of a game here. I'm going to go A to Z through the alphabet. I'm going to make my picks for the best or favorite sort of Scotch whiskey bottles, starting with each letter. It's going to be fun, and it starts right now. My whiskey journey has taken me to Scotland and back. I've explored whiskey education, tastings, and distilleries from Islay to Speyside. And now my journey continues here, with you, on Whiskey Whereabouts. Starting off with letter A, we're easing in. This is an easy one because we have a lot of choices, a lot of distilleries that start with the letter A. And I could have gone several different ways with this. I ended up going with sort of a classic favorite rather than the sort of biggest age statement or biggest price tag, biggest bottle I could find, in part because I decided to put a $200 ceiling on the cost of the bottles. Keep this within reach, keep this reasonable. And a lot of the bottles from some of the A distilleries with the big age statements really crossed over that line, you know, to get the really high quality presentation. And so I went with a favorite, and it's not Ardbeg because I'm going to need Ardbeg later. So I'm going to go with Aberlour, Abunad, AA, alliteration, the well-loved, well-known cask strength, non-age statement sherry bomb from Aberlour. To kick us off, let me know in the comments your pick. Be mindful of the budget, but your pick for letter A. Moving on to B, and we're at a very competitive letter here. There's lots of distilleries to start with B, lots of quality distilleries, some favorites of mine. I sort of looked and compared a lot of different options. Could have gone a lot of different ways. In the end, mindful again of that price cap, I'm going to go with the Ball Blair 18-year, 46% whiskey, a nice healthy age statement, and a nice sort of representative of the B sort of category of distilleries. There was another whiskey, there's a real rival, but I decided to save it for later. It's going to come in down the list. So for now, we'll stick with the Ball Blair 18 among many, many options for letter B. On to C, and less competitive here. There's fewer options, but there are more than one option, but I think there's really one bottle here when we're talking about this budget category, and it's Craigellachie 17-year. That is the 46%. It's a bottle that's bringing a lot of whiskey within this price category. I looked at Caol Ila. The 12-year has that bad Diageo presentation. It really doesn't stack up to what we're looking at with the Craigellachie, but an independently bottled Caol Ila certainly could, well-presented Caol Ila, but I want to keep the list mainstream, available bottles, not one-offs and not rarities, so that we all can compare notes here. Moving on to D, fewer options than you might think. There are several, but I kind of just decided to kind of go with the sort of go-to. It's a go-to whiskey. It's a go-to in this category. If you're perusing the whiskey aisle in alphabetical order, this one would jump out to you, the Deanston 12-year, right? We all know it, and it's a well-presented bottle, good value bottle. That's D. Moving on to E, and we had a lot fewer options. Don't have a lot of distilleries with E, but what we do have is Edred Dower. So I'm going to go with Edred Dower, but I'm going to go with the Caledonia. 46% is a sherry finish, 12-year. That gets us through E. So on to F, and F is another tough one. But I sort of looked at a few different ways to go on this one, and I ended up going to Glengarry, which is not a distillery that begins with F, and it's also a distillery that I think of as exceedingly fine, right? But they do have a whiskey called the Founder's Reserve. It is the sort of higher ABV Glengarry. It's 48%. This is a tough letter here in the US. We don't have Fetter Cairn except for independent bottlings. Felt like cheating a little bit, so we're gonna go with this. Okay, now when we get to G, this is one of the most competitive in terms of the number of candidates, letters on the list, right? When we think of Scotch whiskey, we think of all of those Glens. And when I think of them, I think of Speyside, some Highland. So of course, I'm gonna go with a Glen from Campbelltown. I'm gonna go with the Glen Scotia 18-year, 46%, the rest of the specs. It's a lot of quality whiskey within this price category, so it is emerging as the champion here. There's a lot of competitors. Let me know where you would have went with this, because it is one with a very, very crowded field, but I'm coming out with that Glen Scotia for G. Moving on to H, and there's an obvious distillery with H. I'm not going to go with it. Don't love the sort of presentation of a lot of those whiskeys in this sort of category. Instead, I'm going to go with the Hazelburn, the unpeated, triple distilled whiskey from Springbank with all the specs. Hazelburn's going to get us through H. Moving on to I is, when we talk about Scotch whiskey, for Islay, right? And so I'm going to say I is for Islay barley. And here's Bruichladdich coming in onto the list, the Islay barley. If you go with the 2013, it's an 8-year whiskey. It's a 50% whiskey. It's 75% bourbon, 25% wine casks. It's a really high quality whiskey for this sort of budget. We're well below 50% of our sort of threshold, our cap here, going with the Islay barley. So if I is for Islay, J then is for Jura, right? And it's Islay's neighbor, the other island, Jura, and I'm gonna go with Islay of Jura, and we can get Jura 21 years, only 44%. It's a bourbon, finished in Bordeaux casks. So moving on to K, and K is gonna be a category with quality over quantity. There's not as many candidates, but lots of quality candidates. Lots of quality here among these candidates. And I'm going to go with Kilchoman. I'm going to stay on Islay instead of going to Campbelltown. I'm going to do Kilchoman. And you know, this price category, I'll go with the Lochgorn. And it's a non-age statement. It's Kilchoman, 46%, all the specs. Going to go with that K. I'm sure there are other opinions. Let me know where you would go. L. This was the toughest sort of head-to-head battle when I was preparing my list here. The L. There are multiple distilleries, quality distilleries, starting with L, but for me, this one comes down to a battle between two neighbors separated by about 1.5 miles on the coast of Islay, Lagavulin versus Laphroaig. It's, in this price category, the 16-year, or probably the non-age statement, Lore. Who you got, right? So you've got the 43%, that's sort of Diageo presentation from the Lagavulin 16-year. With the Lore then, you've got the higher ABV, you've got the much better presentation in terms of it not being chill filtered. It's the dilemma, okay? You want the age statement, do you want the ABV, do you want the no chill filtered? I'm gonna go with the Laphroaig. I'm gonna go with the Lore. It's gonna give me double L, alliteration, Laphroaig, Lore for L, a competitive letter. Next we come to M, and there's a very, very obvious distillery that starts with M, and I'm not going to go to them. Instead, I'm going to go to its Speyside neighbor, and I'm gonna go with the Mortlach. And I'm gonna go with their Mortlach 16-year, again, the 43% and the bad specs. Let me know what you would offer in its place. Coming to N, there's a couple of different ways I could have gone on this. I'm gonna go a little outside the box, be a little bit more inclusive, bring in Compass Box, bring in the blended malt, and I'm gonna go for the triple alliteration score here with Compass Box, no name number 3 we're up to. And so this is a 48.9% ABV whiskey, and it is pretty Islay forward. It's a 74.7% Laphroaig, it's about 11% Bowmore. It's more than 7% Mortlach, about 6% Clynelish, and a little bit finishing off with that Highland blend. It's a very expensive blended malt whiskey, and I almost didn't go with it because it is technically limited, but there's a series of these. We're up to 3. We can anticipate maybe there's going to be 4, and given that it's a succession, I decided to put it on to really go with a pretty high-end sort of blended malt to be represented on the list for N. Oh, again, got a couple choices here. One sort of very popular sort of whiskey here could have gone with. I'm choosing to go with the Old Pulteney 18-year, 46% whiskey over the Oban 14-year. So on to P. When I think of P, I think of Port Charlotte. It's going to be the Pack 01. I'm going to go for double alliteration, and this is part of the Cask Exploration series. I reviewed this whiskey on the channel not too long ago. I'll put a link above if you haven't seen that. It's a 56.1% whiskey with these French wine casks involved. It's pretty overpriced relative to the siblings in a core range, but it's well within our budget of the cap for the bottle, so I'm gonna go with the Port Charlotte. On the Q, not as bad as you think. There's a couple options here. I'm gonna go with the Glenmorangie Quinta Ruban. This is the 14-year, the port finished Glenmorangie. Could have gone back to Lefroy quarter cask. I'm gonna go with this one. It's a decent quality whiskey for the price, way, way under our budget cap. Moving on to R, and there's a couple different choices here. I'm gonna go with the Royal Bracla. This is a Doer Zone distillery. A lot of it goes into blends. The Royal Bracla is a 12-year, 46%, non-chill filtered, no color added, Oloroso finished whiskey. That'll get us through R. We get to S, let's not overthink things. Springbank 10, what else are we gonna say? If you haven't seen my review, I'll put a little link up here, check it out. I'm gonna go with the Springbank 10-year, which even with Springbank prices, you should, if you can find it, be able to get a hold of within this price cap. T was tough. There's several distilleries here. There's some really good bottlings out here, and I decided, even though it's not perfect, to go for the Talisker 18-year. It's 45.8% the Talisker ABV, otherwise a pretty bad presentation, but looking for a pretty high quality whiskey in a competitive letter category. This whiskey is pretty expensive and you might say overpriced, but it's under, in most places it should be under our price cap, which is the only thing that matters for our purposes. Consider Tamdhu, look to, maybe Tamdhu 15 be a very, very worthy choice here. I'm gonna go with the Talisker. Once we get to U, it's pretty easy. It's gonna be Ardbeg, it's gonna be the Uigeadail. The cask strength, non-age statement. Ardbeg with the sort of sherry influence gets us through U very easily. Now we're on to V, and we're back at Glen Scotia. We're gonna go with the Victoriana. It's the 54.2%. All the specs. It was the whiskey of the year from the Oswas last year, and it should be available underneath that ceiling, and if it is, it's definitely the choice for letter V. So now we're on to W, and here I'm gonna go with a younger distillery. I'm gonna go with Wolfburn. This is the northernmost distillery on the mainland in Scotland, and it is obviously a non-age statement whiskey with this young distillery. It's called the Northland. It's the first sort of ongoing release for their distillery. The rest of the specs are good, and it's going to get us through W. X is the easiest choice on the board. You'd think it was pretty challenging, but our friends at Glenmorangie have given us a whiskey called Glenmorangie X. It is not a spectacular whiskey. It's a 40% whiskey that has been marketed to go into cocktails as a mixer, sort of competitor to some of those blended malts and some of the other budget whiskeys that they make cocktails out of. It's the normal sort of Glenmorangie batting and then blended in with some Glenmorangie aged in virgin oak, supposed to give it a little bit more of a robust character to stand up to those cocktail ingredients. It may not be the best whiskey on this list, but it is a whiskey that starts with X. Here at Y we have so many choices, it's almost overwhelming. I don't know what you're thinking, that there aren't any whiskeys with Y. Almost every distillery has some, and so since we're going to be talking about years here, I'm going to go for a really big age statement. So I'm going to go with the Benriach 21 years, 46% whiskey. It's peated Benriach. It has bourbon cask and sherry cask, virgin oak cask, Bordeaux wine cask, all the specs, and that big 21-year age statement, which is about as big of a quality whiskey age statement as you're going to be able to get underneath that price ceiling. So for Y, we're going with Benriach 21 year. And now we come to Z, and there are not a lot of Z's in the Gaelic alphabet where these sort of anglicized distillery names come from. A lot of the times, there are actually only 18 letters in the Gaelic alphabet. Z's definitely not one of them. So I'm gonna go with a young distillery called nc'nean, and they make a whiskey called Organic, and that's going to be my choice. And you're waiting to see how this ties back in. And the thing about this distillery is that they're very, very sustainability minded, and they hold themselves out as having already achieved net zero carbon emissions, and that's 20 years ahead of the industry goals. They also claim to have zero landfill waste as a result of their production. They have a lot of other sustainable sort of aspects of their presentation and their sort of approach to everything, but sort of in recognition for them and their admirable achievement here for their zero emissions, their zero waste, I'm going to have nc'nean join the list and represent the final letter. So this was all in just a little fun game to play, and there's so many other options. I'm sure that you would have filled out your list with a lot of differences. Let me know in the comments. Just keep the budget in mind when you do so, ballpark. Let me know what your alternate choices would be. If you had fun with this, you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe over here so you don't miss any of the other fun videos we have coming in the future. I'll see you on the next one.